Welcome back to Know the Code. In Part 2, we will be discussing student conduct charges, meetings, sanctions, and appeals. The first portion of this presentation will discuss how student conduct charges are filed. Any member of the Sage College community, including students, faculty, staff, and administrators, can file a charge of misconduct against a student. After this initial filing, the Vice President will review the misconduct to ensure that it is in the purview of the college, determine whether charges need to be filed, and which type of hearing body will hear the case. The next portion of this presentation will cover student conduct meetings, including the different types of meetings and the rules that apply to all meetings. There are three main types of student conduct meetings, but for the purposes of this presentation, we'll be discussing two of them: the student conduct mediation, an informal one-to-one meeting between a college administrator and a student charged with violating the code of conduct, where both parties work to come to a mutual understanding of responsibility and sanctions, and the student conduct hearing, a formal college proceeding where a member of the college brings charges and the student prepares a defense to both be presented to a neutral hearing officer. In this case, the hearing officer determines responsibility and sanctions. The college has several rules to ensure that your rights are protected during the student conduct process. The first is the standard of evidence used to charge a complainant, which is called the preponderance of evidence. Under this standard, a determination must be made on the basis of whether it is more likely than not that the respondent violated the code of conduct. This is different than what you might be used to in the criminal court, where they use a standard called beyond a reasonable doubt. In that case, you have to be more than 99% sure that the person is responsible. Using preponderance of evidence, though, you only have to be 51% sure, so the bar is lower in finding responsibility. The next rule regards records. If you have any disciplinary action pending against you, your degrees, grades, reports, and transcripts will not be issued until the matter is resolved. If you plan to withdraw from Sage while student conduct proceedings are in process, you do so with charges pending. This means that the charges don't go away just because you withdraw from the college, and if you choose to re-enroll, the college can still find you responsible for those charges. Once it's been determined that a student conduct meeting needs to take place, the college has a strict time limit in which to act. In order to give you enough time to prepare and ensure that the case is adjudicated quickly, the college must plan your student conduct meeting between 5 and 15 days after you've been notified of the charges pending. In order to protect your rights to have your records remain private, all hearings will normally take place with just a few people involved. This includes you, the hearing officer, the complaining party if there is one, any advisors that you might ask to accompany you, and any witnesses called by you and/or the college. The complainant, respondent, and the co-complainant and any advisors will be allowed to attend the entire portion of the Student Conduct Board hearing at which information is presented. Any witnesses called will only be in the room for the duration of their testimony and will leave promptly after. After information has been presented by both sides and the questioning from the hearing officer has concluded, the Student Conduct Board or Student Conduct Administrator shall determine whether the respondent is responsible for the charged violations. In the case of a student conduct mediation, this decision is reached between both the Student Conduct Administrator and the student in question. In a student conduct hearing, the hearing officer makes this decision on their own after private deliberations. If the student, after receiving sufficient notice, does not appear at their Student Conduct Board hearing, their information in support of the charges shall be presented and considered, even if the respondent is not present. This means that the hearing will go on without your presence unless you make additional accommodations with the hearing officer. Additionally, the Student Conduct Board may accommodate concerns for personal safety, well-being, and/or fears of confrontation of the complainant, co-complainant, respondent, and other witnesses during the hearing by providing them with separate facilities, using a visual screen, or permitting participation by telephone, videotape, written statement, or other means. SAGE makes every effort to ensure that the hearing officer for your case is impartial. If you wish to challenge the placement of any member to the Student Conduct Board, you should raise the issue at the start of the Student Conduct Board hearing. If the Student Conduct Board consists of only one individual, that individual must bring the challenge to the attention of the Vice President of Student Life, who will hear the reasons for such a challenge. The Vice President will then decide whether or not to assign a new hearing officer to your case. While there are many similarities between student code of conduct proceedings and what you might see in criminal or civil court, formal rules of process, procedure, and technical rules of evidence are not used in student conduct code proceedings. All student conduct meetings, including both hearings and mediations, have a single verbatim record, which is usually in the form of a tape recording of the meeting. This record remains on file and is property of the SAGE colleges. When requested, a student must appear before a student conduct board, appellate board, or college official for the purposes of providing relevant information to a student conduct code proceeding. This includes both the responding party and any witnesses called. Any co-complainant and the accused student have the right to be assisted during a hearing by an advisor who is a member of the college community but who is not an attorney. The student involved is responsible for presenting his or her own information, and therefore advisors are not permitted to speak or participate directly in the Student Conduct Board hearing. A student should select an advisor, a person whose schedule allows attendance at the time and date of the Student Conduct Board hearing, because delays will not normally be allowed due to the scheduling conflicts of an advisor. The selection of an advisor is the responsibility of the student, though if help is needed, they may request assistance from the Student Conduct Office. The respondent and the Student Conduct Board may arrange for witnesses to present pertinent information to the board at the discretion of the Student Conduct Administrator. SAGE will try to arrange the attendance of possible witnesses who are members of the SAGE community, if reasonably possible, and who are identified by the complainant, respondent, and/or the co-complainant at least 2 weekdays prior to the board hearing. Witnesses will provide information to and answer questions from the Student Conduct Board. Questions may be suggested by the respondent, co-complainant, and/or complainant to be answered by each other and by the witnesses. This will be conducted by the Student Conduct Board with such questions directed to the Student Conduct Administrator rather than to the witnesses directly. This method is used to preserve the educational tone of the hearing and to avoid creation of an adversarial environment. Questions of whether potential information will be received shall be resolved at the discretion of the Student Conduct Administrator. Pertinent records, exhibits, and written statements, including student impact statements, which are written statements made by members of the college's community dealing with the impact that the respondent's conduct has had on a particular student or students or upon SAGE students in general, may be accepted as information for consideration by a Student Conduct Board at the discretion of the Student Conduct Administrator. The complainant or co-complainant may be permitted to withdraw his or her complaint subsequent to its submission to the Vice President for Student Life if, and only if, the Vice President for Student Life is satisfied that the co-complainant's decision is not the result of pressure or intimidation. Admission of any person to the Student Conduct Board hearing other than the complainant, respondent, the co-complainant, and their advisors shall be at the discretion of the Student Conduct Board and/or the Student Conduct Administrator. In Student Conduct Board hearings involving more than one respondent, the Student Conduct Administrator at his or her discretion may permit the student board hearings concerning each student to be conducted either separately or jointly. All procedural questions are subject to the final decision of the Student Conduct Administrator at his or her discretion. If a complaint is withdrawn, no Student Conduct Board hearing will be held. In the event that the complaint is allowed to be withdrawn after a hearing has been completed, the hearings shall cease and no determination will be made. In the event that the complaint is allowed to be withdrawn after the hearing has been completed, any determination or sanctions will be reversed automatically. If the Vice President for Student Life does not allow the complaint to be withdrawn, the Student Conduct Board hearing will proceed under the normal process. The Board will disregard the attempted withdrawal of the complaint in making its determinations and recommending sanctions. This section of the presentation will cover student conduct sanctions. In each case in which a student conduct administrator determines that a student has violated the Student Conduct Code, the sanction shall be determined and imposed by the Student Conduct Administrator. Following the hearing, the Student Conduct Administrator or Student Conduct Board shall advise the respondent in writing of the determination and all of the sanctions imposed, if any. The Vice President of Student Life shall receive a copy of this letter. The following slides go over in detail the types of sanctions the college may impose. Warning: a notice in writing to the student that the student is violating or has violated institutional regulations. Disciplinary probation: a written reprimand for violation of specified regulations. Probation is for a designated period of time and includes the probability of more severe disciplinary sanctions if the student is found to be violating any institutional regulations during the period. Loss of privileges: denial of specified privileges for a designated period of time. Fines: previously established fines may be imposed. Restitution: compensation for loss, damage, or injury. This may take the form of appropriate service and/or monetary or material replacement. Discretionary sanctions: work assignments, service to the colleges, written apologies, or other related discretionary assignments. Parental or guardian notification: in certain circumstances, the college reserves the right to notify or require the student themselves to notify parents and guardians of dependent students when college policies have been violated. Residence hall suspension and expulsion. Suspension: separation of the student from the residence halls for a definite period of time without refund, after which the student is eligible to return. Conditions for readmission may be specified. Expulsion: permanent separation of the student from the residence halls without refund. College suspension and expulsion. College suspension: separation of the student from the college for a definite period of time without refund, after which the student is eligible to return. Conditions for readmission may be specified. College expulsion: permanent separation from the college without refund. Revocation and withholding of degree. Revocation of degree: state colleges may revoke an issued degree due to fraud, misrepresentation, or other violation of the Sage College's standards in obtaining the degree, or for other serious violations committed by a student prior to graduation. Withholding degree: the Sage Colleges may withhold awarding a degree otherwise earned until the completion of the process set forth in the Student Code of Conduct, including the completion of all sanctions imposed, if any. Prohibition from professional practice: the Sage Colleges may take any and all steps it deems necessary to prohibit, limit, or monitor the current or future practice of a profession by an individual found to have committed misconduct, such as notifying the appropriate agency overseeing the profession. Mandatory transcript notations: if a student is found responsible for a crime of violence, the Sage Colleges must make a notation on the student's transcript that she or he was suspended after a finding of responsibility for a code of conduct violation, or expelled after a finding of responsibility for a code of conduct violation. If a student withdraws from the Sage Colleges while such conduct charges related to crimes of violence are pending against the student and declines to complete the disciplinary process, the Sage Colleges must make a notation on the student's transcript that she or he withdrew with conduct charges pending. The transcript notations can be appealed by contacting the provost. Transcript notations for violence-related suspensions shall not be removed prior to 1 year after conclusion of the suspension. Transcript notations for violence-related expulsions shall never be removed from a student's transcript. If a finding of responsibility is vacated for any reason, however, the transcript notation must be removed. The final part of this presentation is on the student conduct appeals process, including the grounds for appeal and how the appeals process works. Appeals can be requested for one or more of the following reasons: to determine whether the penalty is appropriate to the finding, including situations where a student admits to wrongdoing and an agreement is reached on responsibility, but no agreement is reached regarding the sanction. To determine whether the finding is supported by the evidence. To determine whether the student's procedural rights as specified in the Student Conduct Code were violated. Finally, to determine whether new evidence, which was unavailable at the original proceeding, has been discovered. To file an appeal successfully, students should follow the following steps. Appeals shall be in writing and shall be directed to the Vice President for Student Life. Upon receipt of an appeal, the Vice President for Student Life will confirm that the appeal is supported by one of the reasons previously listed. The Vice President for Student Life determines that the appeal falls within one of the above listed categories. A copy of the official record of the hearing will be made available to the appellant as soon as it is available. Once the appellant receives the hearing record, the appellant will have 5 business days from his or her review of the hearing record to present his or her reasons for appeal with supporting documentation. If a proper appeal and submission are filed, the Vice President for Student Life shall appoint an appellate board. The submission, hearing record, and all case documentation shall be delivered to each member of the appellate board. The Vice President for Student Life shall convene an appellate board within 10 days of receiving the appeal. The appellate board shall reach a determination within 10 business days of receiving the appeal. In cases involving appeals by respondents to the appellate board, review of the sanction by the appellate board may not result in more severe sanctions for the respondent. The appellate board may, upon review of the case, find that a violation of the Student Conduct Code did occur, reduce or increase the sanctions imposed by the Student Conduct Board, remand the case to the original officer or Student Conduct Board, recommend the appointment of a new Student Conduct Administrator or Board, affirm or reverse the judgment of the original Student Conduct Administrator or Board, or dismiss the case in its entirety. Congratulations! This concludes Part 2 of the Student Code of Conduct Review. Please proceed to the quiz located on the Sage College's Student Code of Conduct Moodle page. Students are required to score at least a 90% to pass the course. You may retake the quiz as many times as you need.